Britain expected silence, but what King Charles reportedly did on Princess Diana's 65th birthday.
Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life. I pray for the guidance and help of Almighty God.
Has reopened one of the monarchy's deepest emotional wounds. Some call it a heartfelt act of reconciliation, while others believe it changes how history remembers Diana forever.
I will be reducing the extent of the public life I've led so far. My first priority will continue to be our children, William and Harry.
As whispers spread, emotions surged, and questions overshadowed certainty, leaving supporters and critics fiercely divided. But was this a genuine tribute, or something far more complicated? So what do you think? Did Charles make the right decision? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more royal news. The King's decision. For weeks, royal watchers expected July 1st to pass like so many anniversaries before it. Princess Diana's 65th birthday was approaching, and the assumption across Britain was almost universal. The palace would remain silent. No official tribute, no carefully worded statement, no public acknowledgement of the woman whose memory had long occupied one of the monarchy's most sensitive chapters. That silence had become a tradition of its own, one many believed would never change. As newspapers prepared retrospective features and television commentators reflected on Diana's extraordinary legacy, attention focused less on what the royal family might do than on what it would avoid doing. Few imagined there would be any departure from the familiar pattern. The expectation was simple: another quiet day, leaving the public to remember the people's princess in their own way. Then everything appeared to shift. According to palace insiders, King Charles personally approved an unexpected symbolic gesture just days before the anniversary. The decision was reportedly made without fanfare, without advance publicity, and without any attempt to attract cameras. Only a small circle inside the royal household was said to know what had been authorized. Yet word of the king's involvement began circulating almost immediately, setting off waves of speculation across Britain before anyone even understood the full story. The mystery only grew deeper because the palace refused to explain its reasoning. There was no official briefing, no detailed announcement, and no effort to answer the questions that quickly followed. Instead, silence remained, but this time it carried a different weight. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt deliberate, almost as though something significant was unfolding behind closed doors. Commentators struggled to interpret what it could mean. Some believed the king was attempting to acknowledge Diana's lasting place in British history. Others wondered whether this marked a subtle effort to close one of the monarchy's longest-running emotional chapters. More skeptical voices questioned whether the timing was simply too convenient, asking why such a gesture would come nearly 3 decades after Diana's death rather than years earlier. Across social media and newspaper opinion pages, one question appeared again and again. Why now? For many people, the timing was impossible to ignore. Diana's 65th birthday represented more than another anniversary. It symbolized the life she never had the chance to live, the grandmother she never became, and the future forever interrupted. Any action connected to that milestone carried emotional significance far beyond ordinary royal tradition. Whatever King Charles had reportedly approved, it was already accomplishing something few expected. Britain was talking about Diana once again, not because of old headlines or familiar debates, but because of a decision that seemed to challenge years of quiet distance. The answers had not yet emerged, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was no ordinary royal anniversary, and the king's unexpected choice was about to reopen a conversation the nation believed had already been written into history. If one silent gesture changed everything, what unseen decision prompted it? Why are longtime royal observers suddenly rethinking years of tradition? Could the king's quiet move reveal something hidden for decades? The next discovery transforms quiet speculation into an unforgettable royal mystery. Stay tuned. Silence finally broken. The longer the palace remained silent, the louder the questions became. Britain had grown accustomed to anniversaries connected to Princess Diana's passing without official recognition from the highest levels of the monarchy. Over the years, that quiet approach had become an unwritten rule, one that many believed would never be challenged. Yet this time, something felt unmistakably different. Subtle preparations had begun inside royal circles several days before Diana's 65th birthday. They were not the kind of arrangements that announced themselves with grand ceremonies or elaborate public schedules. Instead, they were quiet, carefully coordinated, and visible only to those who paid close attention to the smallest changes surrounding the king's activities. That alone was enough to spark curiosity. Royal observers reportedly noticed unusual adjustments to the king's diary. Meetings were quietly rearranged. Certain engagements appeared to receive unexpected priority, while others seemed deliberately kept away from public attention. None of these details proved anything on their own, yet together they painted a picture that many commentators found difficult to ignore. Soon, speculation spread beyond palace gates. Some royal experts argued that King Charles had reached a point in his reign where acknowledging difficult chapters of royal history had become unavoidable. They believed the symbolic gesture reflected a monarch determined to present a more compassionate institution, one capable of recognizing the emotional scars that still existed within the nation. Others strongly disagreed. Critics questioned whether the timing served another purpose entirely. They wondered whether the decision was designed to reshape Charles's own public image rather than honor Diana herself. To them, the gesture raised as many questions as it answered. If this tribute truly came from the heart, why had it taken nearly 3 decades to happen? Why wait until Diana's 65th birthday to quietly break years of royal tradition? Those competing interpretations quickly divided public opinion. Some people described the reported gesture as an overdue acknowledgement of a woman whose humanitarian work had transformed public expectations of the monarchy. Others remained cautious, refusing to separate emotion from history. Old wounds resurfaced as conversations returned to one of the most debated chapters in modern royal life. Yet despite those disagreements, something remarkable was happening. The discussion had shifted away from blame and toward meaning. Rather than revisiting familiar arguments about the past, people found themselves asking what the king's decision might represent for the future. Had Charles simply chosen to honor Diana's memory for one significant birthday? Or was he quietly changing the monarchy's relationship with one of its most unforgettable figures? That single question lingered everywhere. Every newspaper headline, television panel, and online discussion seemed to circle back to the same mystery. Had the king merely approved one symbolic act, or had he crossed an invisible line that previous generations had carefully avoided? Whatever the truth might be, one fact had become impossible to dismiss. The silence that had defined Diana's anniversaries for years had finally been broken. Not with dramatic speeches or elaborate ceremonies, but with a quiet decision that was already reshaping public conversation. And as more details threatened to emerge, Britain began wondering whether this unexpected moment was only the beginning of a much larger story. Why would this single gesture reopen decades of buried emotion? What unseen truth finally changed Charles's heart? And who quietly recognized its deeper meaning first? Keep watching. Hidden meaning revealed. As speculation continued to spread, attention gradually shifted from what King Charles had reportedly done to what the gesture might actually represent. Historians, royal commentators, and longtime observers all arrived at the same conclusion. Whatever its original intention, the king's decision had become far more than a simple tribute. It had reopened a conversation Britain had never truly finished. For decades, Princess Diana occupied a unique place in the nation's memory. She was remembered not only as a royal figure, but as someone who transformed how compassion was seen inside the monarchy. Whether comforting children in hospitals, supporting charities for the homeless, or standing beside people living with illnesses many feared to approach, Diana had created an image that remained deeply rooted in the public imagination. Her influence stretched beyond official duties. She made countless people believe that kindness could become part of royal leadership. That legacy never disappeared. Instead, it quietly grew with every passing year. Even those too young to remember Diana firsthand learned about her through documentaries, photographs, and stories passed from one generation to another. Her name became linked with empathy, humanity, and a willingness to challenge convention. That was why this birthday carried such unusual emotional weight. 65 was more than another number. It represented the years she never lived, the milestones forever left unfinished, and the countless lives she might have continued to touch. Within this narrative, commentators argued that King Charles understood the significance of that moment better than many expected. As king, he no longer represented only his personal history. He carried the responsibility of leading an institution shaped by both its triumphs and its regrets. Some believed that reality had gradually changed his perspective over time. Rather than trying to rewrite the past, they suggested he had chosen to acknowledge something that could no longer be ignored. Diana's place in British history had become permanent, regardless of old divisions or uncomfortable memories. Recognizing that reality, they argued, was not an act of weakness, but one of acceptance. Not everyone agreed with that interpretation. Some critics remained convinced that no symbolic gesture, however thoughtful, could erase decades of public controversy. They questioned whether history should be softened through carefully timed acts of remembrance. Yet even many of those skeptics admitted that the king's reported decision had achieved something unexpected. It had encouraged the country to reflect on Diana herself instead of endlessly revisiting past conflicts. That emotional shift became increasingly visible. Across Britain, scenes unfolded of families sharing memories around dinner tables, friends discussing where they had been when they first heard of Diana's death, and younger generations asking questions about the woman who had inspired such lasting affection. For a brief moment, political opinions and royal debates seemed to fade into the background, replaced by something far more personal. People were remembering a life instead of reliving a tragedy. And perhaps that was the hidden meaning behind the king's reported decision. Whether intended or not, it reminded the nation that Diana's legacy could never be measured solely by history's conflicts. It lived on in the compassion she inspired, the lives she touched, and the emotions that still united millions nearly 3 decades later. What private conversation changed everything? Why did one quiet response reportedly leave even senior royals unsettled? And what unexpected discovery soon threatened to transform a symbolic gesture into something far more consequential? Stay glued. Private Palace Reactions. Outside the palace, the king's reported decision continued to dominate conversations across Britain. Inside its historic walls, however, the atmosphere was said to be far more complicated. The unexpected gesture had triggered quiet discussions among senior advisors and members of the royal household, each weighing what it could mean for the monarchy's future. While no public disagreement surfaced, opinions behind closed doors were anything but unanimous. Some reportedly believed the king had made the right choice. They argued that enough time had passed for the monarchy to acknowledge Princess Diana's lasting place in the nation's heart without appearing trapped by the conflicts of the past. In their view, Britain had changed, public expectations had evolved, and the institution itself could only benefit from showing a more human side. They saw the symbolic gesture not as an admission of guilt, but as an act of maturity, recognizing that Diana's influence remained impossible to ignore. Others were far less convinced. According to palace sources, some advisors worried that revisiting Diana's memory in such a visible way risked reopening emotional wounds the royal family had spent decades trying to leave behind. They feared that even the smallest gesture could reignite old debates, encourage fresh scrutiny of painful historical events, and once again place the monarchy under an uncomfortable spotlight. To them, silence had always offered a form of protection, however imperfect it seemed. The divide reflected more than strategy. It reflected generations. Younger members of the household reportedly viewed Diana's legacy through the eyes of a public that had embraced openness and emotional honesty. They believed modern leadership required acknowledging difficult chapters rather than pretending they no longer existed. Senior figures, however, remembered the years when every headline surrounding Diana carried enormous pressure for the institution. Their caution came from experience, not indifference. As those different perspectives collided, one question quietly shaped every conversation. How would Britain interpret the king's decision? Would people see compassion, or would they suspect calculation? Would the gesture unite the nation in remembrance, or encourage renewed arguments over events that could never be changed? Even those who supported the decision understood that public perception would ultimately determine whether the moment became a turning point or another source of controversy. Yet King Charles never showed signs of retreating from the course he had chosen. Those closest to the situation reportedly described him as calm and resolute, listening carefully to different opinions while remaining convinced that the symbolic importance of the gesture outweighed the political risks surrounding it. He understood that every royal decision carried consequences, but some moments demanded leadership rather than caution. Diana's 65th birthday, they believed, had become one of those moments. That quiet determination gradually changed the tone of the internal discussions. Even those who questioned the decision began recognizing that its purpose extended beyond immediate headlines. It was about acknowledging a chapter of royal history that continued to shape public feeling nearly 3 decades later. By the time those conversations settled, one reality had become impossible to deny. The king's reported decision was no longer just influencing public opinion. It had also challenged the palace itself to reconsider how history, memory, and compassion could exist together under the crown, setting the stage for an emotional response no one had fully anticipated. How could one tribute awaken emotions millions believed had faded? Why were even younger generations suddenly captivated by Diana's story? And what unexpected discovery was quietly emerging behind the scenes, threatening to reshape everything Britain thought it remembered about its beloved princess? Stay with us. Britain responds emotionally. As the king's reported gesture became the subject of headlines across the country, something unexpected began happening far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. The conversation was no longer centered solely on the monarchy or the decision itself. Instead, it turned toward the woman whose memory had quietly united millions once again. Diana's 65th birthday became less about royal protocol and more about a nation rediscovering its shared emotions. Across Britain, people reportedly found their own ways to remember her. Outside familiar landmarks connected with Diana, small bouquets of flowers began appearing beside handwritten notes and framed photographs. Some messages were simple expressions of gratitude. Others reflected on how Diana's compassion had influenced their lives or inspired them to help others. There were no official instructions encouraging these tributes. They emerged naturally, as though the king's unexpected decision had given people permission to revisit memories they had carried for years. The emotional response extended well beyond those who had lived through Diana's lifetime. Younger generations, many of whom knew her only through documentaries, family stories, and historic photographs, found themselves asking new questions. Parents shared personal memories with their children. Grandparents described where they had been when the world learned of Diana's passing. Classrooms, workplaces, and homes became places where conversations about her life unfolded with fresh curiosity. For many young people, this anniversary became their first opportunity to understand why Diana continued to hold such a remarkable place in Britain's collective memory. Social media quickly reflected that shift. Instead of endless debates about royal controversy, timelines filled with photographs celebrating Diana's humanitarian work, her warmth with children, and her willingness to connect with ordinary people. Stories resurfaced about hospital visits, charity campaigns, and quiet moments of kindness that had remained unforgettable to those who witnessed them. Rather than focusing on conflict, countless discussions centered on the values Diana represented and why those values still resonated decades later. Even longtime critics of the monarchy acknowledged that something unusual had happened. The king's reported gesture had not erased history or settled old disagreements. Instead, it had redirected public attention toward compassion rather than controversy. That subtle change transformed the national conversation in ways few had predicted. For a brief time, Britain seemed less interested in choosing sides and more interested in remembering a remarkable life. Television programs revisited Diana's charitable legacy. Newspapers published reflections on the causes she championed and the people she encouraged others to notice. Radio callers shared emotional stories of meeting her or simply being inspired by her example. Every account added another layer to a legacy that refused to fade with time. What surprised many observers most was how naturally those emotions spread across generations. Diana was no longer remembered only as a royal figure from the past. She became a symbol of empathy that continued to speak to people who had never witnessed her public life firsthand. By now, it was becoming increasingly clear that the king's reported decision had achieved something no formal ceremony could have guaranteed. It had encouraged an entire nation to pause, reflect, and reconnect with Diana's enduring influence. And as Britain embraced that shared moment of remembrance, an even deeper question quietly emerged. If one symbolic gesture could awaken so much emotion, what lasting impact might it have on the future of the monarchy itself? What unexpected truth was still waiting behind palace walls? Why did one quiet decision leave even longtime royal observers questioning everything? And who was about to challenge the meaning of Charles's gesture, threatening to reshape the story in ways nobody expected? Let's find out. Charles faces his past. As Britain's emotional response continued to grow, attention slowly returned to the man whose reported decision had started the conversation. King Charles found himself at the center of renewed public reflection, not because he had offered explanations or revisited old controversies, but because his quiet gesture encouraged the nation to look at history through a different lens. Whether intentional or not, the moment had become deeply personal. For much of his public life, Charles had carried the weight of one of the monarchy's most complicated chapters. Every discussion about Princess Diana inevitably reopened memories of difficult years marked by public scrutiny, family tension, and painful headlines. Those events had become part of Britain's collective memory, shaping how generations viewed both Diana and the institution she once belonged to. Time had passed, but history had never completely loosened its grip. Now, the king appeared to recognize that some chapters cannot simply be left behind. They must eventually be acknowledged, even if they can never be rewritten. His reported decision did not attempt to explain the past or defend earlier choices. Instead, it suggested something quieter. It reflected an understanding that Diana's place in British history stood beyond debate, regardless of differing opinions about the events surrounding her life. That distinction mattered. Commentators observed that there was a significant difference between offering explanations and extending symbolic recognition. One sought to revisit arguments. The other accepted that certain people leave an impact so profound, it becomes part of a nation's identity. Many believed Charles had chosen the second path, allowing actions rather than statements to carry the message. Some viewed that as evidence of how the monarchy itself had evolved. Charles was no longer the Prince of Wales navigating personal challenges under relentless public attention. He now carried the responsibilities of a reigning monarch, where every decision reflected not only individual judgment, but the values of the crown itself. Leadership demanded difficult choices, especially when those choices involved moments that remained emotionally charged for millions of people. That burden extended beyond politics or tradition. It involved memory. Every generation of monarchs inherits achievements worth celebrating and challenges that cannot be ignored. Charles understood that Diana's 65th birthday represented one of those defining moments. The anniversary offered a rare opportunity to acknowledge the passage of time while recognizing that compassion and remembrance need not weaken the institution. Instead, they could strengthen its connection with the people it served. Perhaps that became the greatest significance of all. One quiet decision made without grand speeches or dramatic ceremonies inspired millions to remember Diana not simply as a princess of the past, but as a lasting symbol of kindness whose influence reached beyond generations. In the end, history itself had not been rewritten. It had simply been viewed through a gentler lens, leaving Britain deeply moved and quietly changed forever together. That shift did not shout, but lingered in national memory, quietly reshaping how a generation understands loss, legacy, forgiveness, and the enduring presence of Diana within Britain's collective heart. Whether people praised the king's reported decision or questioned its motives, few denied its emotional impact. It transformed a single anniversary into something far greater than a royal event. It became a meditation on legacy, responsibility, forgiveness, and the enduring power of memory. Yet one final question remained. Could this remarkable moment influence not only how Britain remembered Diana, but how future generations would understand the monarchy itself? Could one quiet decision truly rewrite history? Why are even longtime critics rethinking everything they believed about Diana and the monarchy? And what emotional truth emerged after the silence settled? History quietly changes. By the end of Diana's 65th birthday, the reported gesture from King Charles had become something far greater than a single moment of royal symbolism. It marked the beginning of a quiet shift in how Britain chose to remember one of the most influential women ever connected to the monarchy. Nothing about the past had changed. The years of joy, heartbreak, controversy, and loss remained exactly as history recorded them. Yet the way people looked at that history seemed subtly different. Many observers described the moment as the closing of one chapter and the careful opening of another. Rather than allowing Diana's story to remain permanently defined by tragedy, the king's reported decision encouraged people to focus on the compassion, courage, and humanity that had always been at the center of her public life. Her legacy no longer seemed trapped by old disagreements. Instead, it appeared ready to speak to a new generation that had never experienced those difficult years firsthand. The monarchy also appeared to take an important step forward. It did not attempt to rewrite history or erase uncomfortable memories. Instead, it acknowledged that difficult chapters could exist alongside respect, reflection, and understanding. For many, that represented a more confident institution, one willing to recognize the complexity of its own past without allowing it to define its future. Across Britain, conversations gradually became less about blame and more about remembrance. Families continued sharing stories of where they had first encountered Diana's remarkable influence. Young people discovered why so many older generations still spoke about her with such warmth. Historians reflected on how public memory often evolves, revealing that time does not necessarily diminish great figures, but sometimes deepens appreciation for what they truly represented. Forgiveness also became part of the discussion, though not in the simple sense of forgetting painful events. Instead, people considered whether a nation could honor someone's legacy while accepting that history itself would always remain imperfect. That quiet reflection carried enormous emotional weight because it suggested healing was possible without pretending the past had never happened. As for King Charles, this account leaves his true intentions open to interpretation. Some believed the reported gesture reflected personal growth. Others saw it as thoughtful leadership during a significant moment in national memory. Still, others questioned whether the symbolism arrived far too late. Yet regardless of those differing opinions, the outcome remained remarkably similar. Britain spent Diana's 65th birthday talking not about conflict, but about compassion, legacy, and the enduring influence of a woman whose story continues to shape the nation's heart. Perhaps that became the greatest significance of all. One quiet decision, made without grand speeches or dramatic ceremonies, inspired millions to remember Diana not simply as a princess of the past, but as a lasting symbol of kindness, whose influence reached beyond generations. It was never about changing the facts of history. Instead, it encouraged people to look back with greater understanding, compassion, and honesty. Across Britain, conversations quietly shifted as many reflected on Diana's remarkable ability to connect with ordinary people and the lasting impact of her humanitarian work. Younger generations discovered her story through a fresh perspective, while those who remembered her life found new reasons to reflect on her enduring legacy. The monarchy, too, appeared more willing to acknowledge the emotions that had shaped one of its most difficult chapters. In the end, history itself had not been rewritten. It had simply been viewed through a gentler lens, leaving Britain deeply moved and quietly changed forever together, with Diana's memory continuing to inspire hope, compassion, and unity. So, what do you think? Did King Charles's gesture truly honor Diana's legacy, or was it simply too late? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more royal stories every week.